and welcome to Myth Monsters. My name is Erin and I'll be your host for these little snack bite-sized podcasts on folklore and mythical monsters from around the world. These podcasts focus on the actual cryptids, folklore and mythic monsters from global mythology, rather than focusing on the full stories of heroes and their big adventures. I'll also be dropping in some references that they have to recent culture and where you can see these represented in modern day content so that you can learn more and get as obsessed as I am about these absolute legends of the mythological world. We are back, hello, and I'm ready to tackle the world of monsters for 2025. Thank you all for your patience. I appreciate you sticking around with me during this massive hiatus, and a lot of you have made your way through the library, which is amazing. I'm feeling much better and more like myself, ready to invest time in the podcast again, after so many things happening last year. For those who want to know, I lost my grandmother in December 23 and was her estate executor, so selling her house was a really hard process. I've never done it before. And alongside that, I was also in the process of donating a kidney to my dad, so it was all a lot of health things alongside the general stresses of my day job and surviving in the world we live in today as a neurodiverse person. But thankfully, I am on the flip side of most of that stress now, so I'm thrilled to be able to come back into the podcast space. Again, big thank you for bearing with me and for all of your lovely messages that I got. It really meant a lot to me to have the support of you, my lovely listeners, and I'm going to give it my all to pay it back to you in super interesting episodes this year, including almost every single monster that I have had sent through to me as a request or has been recommended I have had this year in the running order, so super exciting. And what a way to come back than with maybe one of the greatest monsters to ever walk into fictional history. The great one, Cthulhu, from Lovecraftian mythology, or Cthulhu mythos, named after our headline monster this week. Cthulhu is actually quite hard to describe, although I am very sure we're all thinking of the same entity in our heads. He typically drives anyone who gaze upon him insane, so technically all of the descriptions of him are different, and from not such reliable sources. However, I will tell you what we all believe he is meant to look like. Cthulhu is generally described as a giant, mountain-sized or bigger entity with a vaguely human body, but a squid-like face with long tentacles which are fully movable and slimy and gross. He is usually described as either being a dark green, blue or purple colour, and has bat-like wings that I think personally are a little bit too small for his body, and I highly doubt he'd be able to fly with them, and I reckon they're just for show. His hands and feet are replaced with claws, much like a lobster, and he uses them to pick up prey, but they are described technically as flabby in one account, which I can't picture but also can't get out of my head. However, he is sometimes described differently and does change throughout the different stories of him. For instance, he's sometimes described as a shape-shifting mass of tentacles with a single cycloptic eye in the middle, or even sometimes a gas cloud. What's even funnier is that sometimes he's described as the thing that cannot be described, so I feel like we've covered all bases here. He is generally referred to as a he, but he's actually what the Lovecraft universe considers a great one. He's also kind of the big deal amongst the other great ones, kind of the big boss, so the others in the universe respect his goals and ambitions for the planet. Within this mythos, the Great Old Ones are previous gods of Earth, and I have a good little quote to explain what they do. They worshipped, so they said, the Great Old Ones who lived ages before there were any men, and who came to the young world out of the sky. Those old ones were gone now, inside the earth and under the sea, but their dead bodies had told their secrets in dreams to the first men, who formed a cult which had never died. Because of this, Cthulhu is apparently a millennia years old, and the old god's creations were linked to the stars themselves, making it possible as he is as old as the universe itself. He was said to come down to Earth as a great priest of the Great Old Ones, and when the stars were right, he could actually portal himself down onto the planet. They defeated the existing beings and took their place, but went to sleep in this palace he'd made in the Pacific Ocean, and slept there for so long that the ocean actually formed around him and trapped him there. What a dummy. I also forgot to mention that he can speak any language. However, he predominantly speaks a language called Relayan, or Cthulhuian. My pronunciation might be horrendous, by the way, these are made up words. I have one phrase that is in this language completely. I'm not even going to bother attempting to say it because it is all over the shop. I'm sorry. You can look it up if you want to look at how it's spelt. I don't know how to show it to you, so I'm not going to. Now, in regards to powers, he's got a lot because he's God. He's known to be a shapeshifter, but he's also completely unkillable and only regenerates or reforms upon his death, although often not in the same form he had before. Once he is defeated, all of these old gods return to a slumber-like hibernation and can only be woken with the assistance of their cultists, and some believe this opens some kind of dimensional gateway to summon them. A good quote about them coming back is, "That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die." Cthulhu also had the power to drive all that spoke to him or saw him insane, and he was sometimes known as the Dream Speaker, as he could reach out psychically to his cult members and others alike to communicate in his prison, and could also reach out through any idols made of him as well. The great gods also were linked to the elements, and Cthulhu was associated with water amongst these. He was considered amphibious and was able to swim, unlike his brethren, and he could manifest himself as fog, rain or water, but he couldn't manifest anywhere near or as fire or heat. It most likely explains why his palace is at the bottom of the ocean too. He is very linked to being a sea monster of some sorts. Due to his massive mass, of course, he could just crush you like a bug or pull you apart with his massive floppy pincers. And he will give chase if you're spotted by him if you don't go mad first. Although I said he's unkillable, he is not invulnerable, and you can damage him through normal means. The best way to completely destroy his form is to nuke him, which is extreme, but at least he's very far out into the water, I suppose. It's noted that his first escape from his prison was in 1925, where he chased down a sailor's boat and drove the entire crew to kill themselves. So he's a pretty scary beast to come across. And just to finish this description off, there's not really any mention of him eating or reproducing in any of the books surrounding him, I'm afraid, but it is theorised that he lives off of the souls of humans that he terrorises whilst they sleep. His ultimate goal is to return the world to anarchy, which existed before civilizations formed, and there is that cult that loves him that is that passionate to do the same thing. So, before we move on to anything origin-wise, I need to make one thing very clear. This is a creature from a fictional story. We all know that it was created by a person, but importantly, Cthulhu is mentioned in about 100 pieces of texts, and he's now also in the public domain. So it's really hard now to differentiate between what's canon and what's not. So everything I've told you here so far and going forward, I have researched, but I cannot 100% guarantee that it is from Lovecraft or the Cthulhu mythos themselves, because quite frankly, I'm not reading all of his work to figure that out. And the joy of fictional monsters is that they are just that, and they can be interpreted and added to by others, and if enough people believe it, it kind of becomes canon anyway. Moving on though, let's talk about etymology. The word Cthulhu comes from the word chthonic, which, if you listen to my show often, you know is a Greek word meaning of the earth. The Greek underworld and all the gods and creatures who live within it are considered chthonic, and in theory, as Cthulhu is a god living deep in the parts of the earth, he is no different, hence his description. He does, though, have a couple of more nicknames, such as the one who cannot be described, we talked about earlier, him who is to come, him who will rise again, and him who lies dreaming. but all of those are pretty self-explanatory, so I'm not going to go through them. But let's talk about something 100% more interesting, and that's where this monster came from and the inspiration behind him. So Cthulhu and the universe that he lives in was a creation of the American author H.P. Lovecraft, which is why I'm referring to Lovecraftian mythology, or just Lovecraft as an entity, as he is such a prolific writer that he has his own genre of books and storytelling. Most people know Lovecraftian when you talk about it, although they might not know the background of what that potentially means. Lovecraft wrote a short story back in 1926, and yes, Cthulhu is that old, called The Call of Cthulhu, which was published in a magazine called Weird Tales. It's written in an almost documentary style and opens with one of possibly the most epic lines in literature history. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The story is realistically told through a manuscript and talks about the findings of a professor told through notes from people that he had spoken to about the beast known as Cthulhu and the cult that worshipped him. There are only 3 chapters, and the first explains the dreams of a student who had carved an idol of the monster, the second of an inspector who raided a cult headquarters in New Orleans and found the bodies of 100 men used in a sacrifice to Cthulhu. He ends up interrogating the cultists and finding out more about the monster and the rituals. And the last chapter is about that sea voyage and describes how the boat's crew found a hidden island, the hidden city of Riley, which is where Cthulhu lives, and saw Cthulhu before stabbing his head with the boat and technically saving humanity for now. Cthulhu was then the main attraction for Lovecraft, but funnily enough was only mentioned in one story, but with him being mentioned in other pieces of his work very vaguely till his death in about 1937. The Call of Cthulhu is the first piece within what is known as the Cthulhu mythos, which is a collection of work around Cthulhu, but written by authors other than Lovecraft himself, and is still going today with over 100 pieces featuring him as a character. It's believed that the inspiration for Cthulhu was the legendary Kraken from Scandinavian mythology, which I've covered in another episode if you want to know more. This is due to the poem named The Kraken by Alfred Lord Tennyson from 1830, which depicts a giant octopus or squid sleeping beneath an abyssal sea, which Lovecraft absolutely loved, this ancient, dreamless, uninvaded sleep. But other Lovecraftian scholars cite the work of Lord Dunsany to be his main inspiration, as he loved his work, which often talks about gods sleeping, and if they're awoken, it means the end of the world. Lovecraft is often cited as the creator of cosmic horror for this piece, but his work wasn't really celebrated until after his death, and his popularity rose over the 20th century, and where now he is celebrated as one of the most influential horror writers ever. I'm afraid to say though, Lovecraft was a bad person. He was known to be a horrendous racist, verging on white supremacist, and often wrote about what he thought of people of colour in his works, which was not positive, and I certainly will not repeat here, and don't recommend anyone generally look up. He was also a bit of a sexist and believed that women were naturally to be discriminated against, and there were very few women in his pieces, and next to no romance or sex, and if there was, it was negatively portrayed. So, it's up to you what you want to do with this information. Either way, he is very, very long dead, and a terrible person. Cthulhu and the Call of are now within the public domain, as I mentioned earlier, so the character is very often used in modern media and other stories. So as I said at the beginning of this segment, his lore has really been built by others more than Lovecraft himself, which I think could only be a positive, and it's become more of a community monster than his through the whole 20th century up to now. we do have to talk about the cultural impact of the eldritch horror and cosmic horror aspect on the modern media space though, as Cthulhu is the inspiration behind a lot of monsters we know and love today. For instance, Mind Flayers is the biggest one. In D&D and Stranger Things, or wherever you've seen them in movies, TV shows, games, board games, are all inspired by this monster. And you can see why physically, but they are also able to be psychically powered just like him. They are an absolute coin for coin match. Cthulhu has also been used in politics to demonstrate voting for a greater evil during the US 2016 campaign and the Polish 2010 campaign. He also has had multiple scientific names for new animals using his name, such as the spider Pomona Cthulhu, or a new moth, Speridiona Cthulhui, for instance. But he's also being used as a character directly in plenty of shows and movies now, completely unattached to copyright. So, let's get into that now, shall we? Cthulhu is a monster that is frequently mentioned in passing in modern media, and has, of course, his own cult following, which is something I haven't really spoken about, but there are a few individuals on this planet who genuinely believe Cthulhu does exist. I think you're insane, but there's going to be a lot for this one in modern media, so please note I won't be able to include everything here. For art, you can actually see the original inspiration sketch by Lovecraft online of a Cthulhu idol if you Google it. It's the main picture on his Wikipedia page. But generally, because it's a fictional monster, most of the art is fan work, and I'd recommend just having a scroll through DeviantArt and such sites like that to find some really cool independent pieces around this monster. They are usually absolutely epic, so I really recommend it. In movies though, we have Cthulhu, Underwater, The Deep Dark, Cast a Deadly Spell, The Last Lovecraft, Relic of Cthulhu, Glorious, In the Mouth of Madness, The Voyage of the Dream Treader, Godzilla, Necronomicon, The Testimony of Randolph Carter, Witch Hunt, Forever Evil, The Deep Ones, The Haunted Palace, Innsmouth, The Resurrected, The Whisper in the Darkness, The Call of Cthulhu, Die Monster Die, The Dunwich Horror, Howard Lovecraft the Film Series, AM 1200, The Evil Dead, Reanimator, Hellboy, The Black Goat, Mad God, In Search of Lovecraft, and Colour Out of Space. For TV, we have Doctor Who, Housing Complex C, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Demon Bane, Ghostbusters, Ultraman, Superman the Animated Series, The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Stranger Things, South Park, The Simpsons, Final Space, Inhumanoids, Scooby-Doo, Love, Death and Robots, Rick and Morty, SpongeBob SquarePants, Robot Chicken, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, Gravity Falls, Ben 10, Dark Shadows and Supernatural. In video games, we have ones such as Call of Cthulhu, and there's one from 2003 and one from 2019, Shin Megami Tensei, Prisoner of Ice, Pray for Death, Castlevania, the whole series of Castlevania, the Fate series, Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, Robert D. Anderson and the Legacy of Cthulhu, Sherlock Holmes The Awakened, Scribblenauts, Baldur's Gate, Cthulhu Saves the World, Hamilton's Great Adventure, The Secret World, Smite, Tentacult, World of Warcraft and Warcraft, Cards of Cthulhu, Cthulhu Saves Christmas, The Sinking City, Call of the Sea, Eldritch, Sunless Sea, Lovecraft's Untold Stories, Mag Runner Dark Pulse, Stygian, Reign of the Old Ones, Gibbous, A Cthulhu Adventure, Worshippers of Cthulhu, and Sucker for Love. And yes, that is a Cthulhu romance simulator. My book recommendation this week is tricky if you don't want to read Lovecraft himself, although I can recommend Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos, which is a collection of the mythos written by others, but are within the mythos itself and considered canon. A funner suggestion though is What to Do When You Meet Cthulhu, A Guide to Surviving the Cthulhu Mythos by Rachel Gray for something a bit different. Or you can get them all at once and look at the Mammoth Book of Cthulhu, new Lovecraftian fiction by Paula Garan, for a great summary of everything in the mythos. Now it's time for Do I Think They Existed? No. I mean, that much is obvious, right? Cthulhu, as much as he is considered one of the great monsters, is really considered a great fictional monster, with absolutely no link to any monster in mythology or within real life. He's a made-up creature with epic powers, and one that is as prevalent within modern media as anything within Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter. But at least these ones are kind of based off of something in reality, or at least an ancient myth or ancient cultural point. The concept that he is this great sleeping god who is awakened and living under the sea is really cool, but I think if you honestly believe that Cthulhu exists and is a god, I really do think you should get yourself checked out. I'm completely serious, and I don't tend to talk about religion on a personal basis, but that one is a really big fantasy boy. He's not real. Will I one day regret these words as I'm consumed by the thing that cannot be described? Maybe, but only at that point will I admit that I was incorrect about him existing. I'm just going to say it now. However, what I will say is the modern media pool with Cthulhu is massive. He's an epic monster, and seeing him on the big screen with his old god pals and the idea of this other universe sleeping beneath us is super cool. And whilst Lovecraft was genuinely an awful human being, his writing did capture the imagination and bring this monster to life, and I'm very glad that it kind of lives outside of Lovecraft now. So there's that, I guess. I will say, you may have guessed, as I've done a very wide lens approach to Cthulhu in this episode, that I have never read anything Lovecraftian. I was gifted the Necronomicon when I was 17, and it always looked too intimidating to read. It's a huge book, so I hope I've done the monster justice based on my research outside of the stories themselves for my Cthulhu fans. It was a lot to digest when you have no concept of what really he's like. But what do you think? Did Cthulhu terrorise the earth and sea? Let me know on social media. I would love to know what you think about this one. Now hey, I think it was a great monster to come back to, and I hope all of the people who requested a Lovecraftian monster now feel satiated. I honestly don't know very much about that universe, and maybe I should have a closer look to get a better grasp on more of this epic mythology, but maybe I won't. Who knows? Next week, we are heading over to Deutschland and looking at a little beast that has graced the walls of log cabins all over the alpine forests. The Wulpetinger. Make sure to bring your own taxidermy kit next Thursday for this little rodent menace. I think a rabbit's a rodent. For now, thank you so much for listening. It's been a pleasure to come back. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give it a rating on the service you're listening on. It means the absolute world. But I am on literally every type of social media platform for any questions or suggestions on what monsters to cover next, and I'd really love to hear from you. I promise I do get through them. This year is basically entirely requests. The social media handles for TikTok, YouTube and Instagram are Myth Monsters Podcast. The Twitter is Myth Monsters Pod, but I am moving away and going on to Blue Sky, and I'm under Myth Monsters as well. But all of our content can always be found at mythmonsters.co.uk, and you can find us on Good Pods, Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon if you want to help me fund the podcast as well. Come join the fun though, share this with your pals. They might love me as much as you do. But for now, stay spooky, and I'll see you later, babes.